Shahnaz Hocam, are you ready? Do you have any problem about your mobile connection?
No, I don't have a connection problem. Professor Traxler, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for sharing your time with us. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. I'm good. Yeah, busy, but good. Thanks. You?
Yes, I know that you are so busy. Actually, I read about your CV and I'm so impressed because you are known as the pioneer of mobile learning, and thank you so much. It will be a very interesting thing for us to listen. Thank you so much.
Okay, so shall I?
Let me introduce you to the listeners, please. And Professor Traxler is a professor of mobile learning and director of the Learning Lab at the University of Wolverhampton. He's a founding director of the International Association for Mobile Learning, associate editor of the International Journal of Mobile and Blended Learning, and of Interactive Learning Environments. He is known as the pioneer of mobile learning, I guess, although you don't like the term. I watched your video on YouTube, you don't like this term, but you are very right about this because mobile learning was more of a futuristic term for all of us. But right now it is part of our lives as lecturers. And some people think that mobile learning is more effective while there is still enormous opposition among the academics. So we're so excited to hear your insights. Thank you so much. The ground is yours, Professor. Thank you so much again.
Okay, thank you. I'll try to share my screen. Yep.
Yes, at the bottom of the screen, you will
Yeah,
see
done
a
it.
green button, share screen. Yes. Okay.
And okay.
Yes, we see the screen. Thank you so much.
And okay, thank you very much for the chance to talk. Thank you for the introduction. I guess, well, to some extent, I've moved on from talking about mobile learning. And so I won't start by talking about mobile learning. I'll probably end up by talking about mobile learning. I was specifically interested in the impact of COVID on education, and mobile learning appears in there somewhere, but maybe in a different context and for a different reason. So, okay, my title, The Impact of COVID-19 on Education and Emergency Remote Education. And what I'm going to do is draw on a piece of work that we did at Wolverhampton for the UK government, for the DFID, as it says there. DFID is the Department for International Development. And we did the work for a particular unit in DFID called the EdTech Hub. And they were particularly interested in the role of learning technology in supporting education through crisis. So that's what we were funded to investigate. And so this is a description of the work, but what becomes very obvious and very important is the role of methods in this research. How doing any kind of investigation is very critically affected by the way that you do it. And this is especially important for this work because it's not conventional empirical research or quantitative research. It's an attempt to generate government policy. And so we're very aware of the impact and of the need to be rigorous. But as I say, being rigorous is problematic for a variety of reasons. So these are the people I worked with, my colleagues, Matt Smith, Howard Scott, and Sarah Hayes. We're all based in the Education Observatory at the University of Wolverhampton. And we were commissioned by the UK government to look at the role of learning technology or maybe educational technology. To give you some background, as you can see in the middle of the slide, actually the government were interested in COVID-19 and they were also interested in the aftermath. What is the world like? What is education like post COVID-19? And they were interested in digital responses that would support education systems, would support the continuity of education systems, but they were also very conscious of the possibility that these digital responses to COVID might actually negatively impact some people or communities who were already disadvantaged. And they wanted us to explore whether that was true, whether if you support the education system through learning technology, through digital technology, through educational technology, whether that is actually a problem, whether it actually makes the digital divide worse rather than better, and whether that is true for people who are disadvantaged or marginalized or disempowered or disenfranchised. and they wanted us to particularly think about local and national decision makers, policy makers, and to think about that in the context of good infrastructure and poor infrastructure. And they also thought that there was a possibility that the global south could be learning from, the global north could be learning from the global south. They were interested in what they call reverse learning, because there is such a momentum and prestige that usually the global south is learning from the global north, but actually the global north is often, the global south is often existing in challenging conditions all the time. And suddenly, because of COVID, the global north is also existing in challenging conditions all the time. So was there something that we in Europe, North America, in the developed world could be learning from Africa or Asia or South America in these very, very difficult times? And I guess also, because the work was being funded by the UK government unit called the EdTech Hub, was there something already problematic about the word EdTech or educational technology? You know, if you talk about EdTech or educational technology, are you automatically buying into a particular system, a particular way of thinking about things, a particular set of technologies? You know, are you talking about learner management systems and virtual learning environments implicitly? You know, are you excluding other possibilities? Are you immediately talking about a particular set of vendors as well as a particular set of technologies? So does the word EdTech immediately lock you into a particular mindset? So we were conscious of that as a difficulty. Now this seems obvious. How did we go about the research? We did a systematic literature review, we ran Delphi sessions, and we looked at case studies. And that seems fine, it seems okay, it seems conventional, it seems mainstream. But we recognized that any of those could be quite problematic. I mean, just as a footnote, Delphi sessions, if you don't know, are those, they're not focus groups, but they're those sessions where you get expert opinion or expert judgment kind of around the table online to see if there is something when you read between the lines. You know, so for the literature review, we had teams reading the literature, reading what the literature said, but experts can tell you what the literature didn't say. Experts can kind of see stuff in the background, see the context. And we hope that case studies would be something that was very easy for policymakers, not academics, to get their heads round. And we were very conscious that one of the problems with academic research is possibly the way that we write it, that we're not thinking of our audience. And we're not thinking of our audience both in terms of style, you know, that policymakers maybe have 5 minutes to read something, not 5 hours, but also you can only, as it were, move them from where they are. You know, you can reform their thinking, you can't revolutionize their thinking. So case studies are sometimes a better way of doing that. But we thought there were more systemic problems with literature reviews because, well, if I go back, I mean, clearly for a systematic literature review, we were looking at specific search terms, pandemic, COVID, EdTech, educational technology, policy, distance learning, online learning, virtual learning. And that is clearly the strength of a systematic literature review, that you hit all of the targets you're looking for. You know, you explicitly say what you're aiming at. So it might be any journals from 2001 to 2021. And you say what you're searching for: minorities, nomads, ethnic minorities, and so on. And whilst that's a good thing in terms of rigor and accountability, and accountability is important because we were getting paid. So there was a contract. So we have to, you know, prove that we've earned the money. But as I say here, the problem with a systematic search strategy is that you only hit all the usual suspects. You hit what everyone else is hitting. You don't uncover anything that's out of the box. You don't uncover anything unusual. You hit what you're aiming for, but you're also hitting what everyone else is aiming for. And one of the aspects of COVID is the amount of literature, of reviews being generated by UNESCO, USAID, DFID, IDRC. Everyone is producing these kinds of documents. And again, as I say here, oh, sorry, how did that happen? As I say here, there is a risk that what we're doing in using a systematic literature review, it's moving, it keeps moving. What we're doing when we use a systematic literature review is just reinforce groupthink. We just we ask the same questions as everyone else, and so we get the same answers. So we need to find ways of not duplicating what everyone else is doing. Otherwise, we're adding no value at all. It's also a bit problematic that systematic literature reviews are structured and hierarchic, and it's very difficult with a hierarchic strategy, working from the keywords to the abstract to the text, to hit the stuff that might be unusual or interesting or counterintuitive. So that was one of our missions, to actually say something unusual because everyone else was saying the same as everyone else. But there are other problems with this kind of approach. And one is, of course, that no one reports their failures. No one tells you where they mess up, because no one gets promoted or funded when they mess up. So we actually need to look for failures as well as successes. And if you look at the, but actually failures are very difficult to find. And also funders and agencies won't report their failures, because there is a kind of food chain. You know, the money is working its way down from the government to ministries, from agencies to institutions to researchers, and everyone is reporting upwards. It was a success, it was a success, it was a success. Otherwise, they don't get any money in future. So that means that what people are reading is very significantly biased or skewed because of these problems. And that there are other issues as well, which one of them is that, as I say here, that many aspects of social science, so business, education, we're not very good at reasoning about, thinking about, because we can't clearly establish cause and effect. It's not physics, it's not chemistry. And so in the literature of international development, what you see a lot of the time is multi-causality and unexpected consequences. So something happened, but we don't know why it happened. And if you're then trying to give advice to governments and you don't know why things happen, that's very difficult. You know, because we can't say do A, do B, do C, and you'll get the result you require, because we don't know if A, B, and C actually have any effect. Because it's all of these initiatives that we're looking at, that we're trying to learn from, are complex social phenomena. Other aspects are that clearly a lot of the stuff, most of the stuff that we read is written by academics. It's not written necessarily by people making projects on the ground. It's not written by activists. It's not written by government departments. And the fact that it's written by academics, again, means you're missing learning from so much. Also, of course, most of it is written in English. So there could be several parallel universes in French or Russian, or indeed Turkish, you know, the rest of the world is not hearing about. And then also, I mean, the only reason that we read papers is because people write papers, and the usual reason people write papers is because they do projects. The usual reason they do projects is because they get funded to do projects, and the projects they get funded to do very much depend on what the funder is going to pay for. So we might not get reports about anything revolutionary or transformative because government won't give us the money anyway. So what you get are papers that are, if you like, aligned to the preferences of the funder. What is it that the funder wants to hear? And probably what they want to hear is incremental reform, not revolutionary transformation. For the reason I mentioned before, they can't go and tell the head of the government that they put their money on something revolutionary and it didn't work. It's a lot easier to put your money on something that says we're going to make a 5% improvement rather than change the entire planet. So those were some of the problems that we saw in the usual academic methods. And there was a different, some of the phrases I've got there, you know, if you look at the literature and if you look at who pays for the projects, you can see that projects are doomed to succeed. They're going to be written up as a success because USAID provided the money, and USAID wants to hear they were a success. So they are destined to succeed. They are doomed to succeed. But more importantly, maybe the research was specifically about people who are hard to reach, communities and maybe cultures that are hard to reach. And if they're hard in terms of making an educational impact. So if they're hard to reach, they're going to be difficult to research as well. So these are all challenges. But in looking for ideas, interventions, initiatives that might be important, this then becomes a bit paradoxical, because what we found was that, and I guess this is going to be true of any social science, so it might also be true of economics and business education and business or startups, you know, anything like that, that actually context is crucial to the outcomes. And context might mean anything like tangible infrastructure, roads, highways, trains, connectivity, mains electricity, secure buildings. You know, all of that is part maybe of the physical context, but also part of the context is culture, community, ethics, ethos, and a lot of intangible things. And all of those are part of the context, and it's the context which makes that vital difference between success and failure. But unfortunately, context is probably unknowable. You can't know everything about the context of an intervention or the context of a project, or the context of a program, or the context of initiative, or of an initiative. You can't know everything, so you can't know why it succeeds. So you might as well ignore context. That's the paradox. Context is vital, but you might as well ignore it because you can never know it completely. And the reason we were having to say that was because we're clearly interested in what ideas in the context of the pandemic, what ideas can help people learn if we transfer them from one context to another. And context is completely unknowable, so we might just as well do it at random. Let's just look for anything, everything. Success or failure, we don't care. You know, if it's a failure in one context, it might still be a success in a different context. If it was a success in one context, it might be a failure in a different one. You know, we can try and take ideas from Canada to Cuba or from Turkey to Tanzania, but we don't know enough about the context and the causality. So, hell, let's just go ahead and do it. You know, try it. And that made us look for concrete examples, techniques, tips. You know, they could be high level conceptual or they could be specific, you know, use WhatsApp. You know, that might be a really easy, concrete suggestion. And so, one of the things that we found was indeed that, as I say here, that responses that sustain or support the education system, or indeed the system, the government system, the university system, the education sector, risk increasing the disadvantage of people that are ignored by the education system or are oppressed by the education system or are failed by the education system. You know, and who might they be? Well, they might be indigenous peoples or nomads because they're outside the education system. They might be refugees or internally displaced persons. They might be people whose language or mother tongue is not the national language. Or they might be people who are disabled cognitively or physically. So, for example, if you put money into the school system and travelers, nomads, indigenous people, the Roma, for example, they're outside the system and they're already disadvantaged. So putting money, no, sorry. Okay. Putting money into the education system when they're already below the education system or outside the education system just increases their problems, increases their disenfranchisement or their disempowerment. But actually, of course, in most countries in the world, the people being excluded or outside the education system are girls and women. Because if you look at most countries in Africa, girls leave schooling before boys. Boys stay in the education systems for longer. There are more boys at university, there are more boys at secondary school. But it also includes adults, and not just adults, because if you look at most of the world, most children don't get beyond primary education. So our concern was that any strategies that use EdTech, any strategies that put money into the education system, just actually disadvantage adults, they disadvantage girls and women, they disadvantage minority languages. So, for example, South Africa has 12 national languages, but actually it has quite a few non-national languages. Where I live, there are two languages, English and Welsh. And the education system is prejudiced in favour of of English. So you can see if you put resources into the education system, what you do is disadvantage people more. Okay, so what was our thinking? Well, actually, our thinking, I'm now going to say mobile, so we've got there. Our thinking was that people may be in the education system, people may be outside the education system, but actually there are technologies, hardware technologies and software technologies and network technologies that most people are using and have access to. So, and that is obviously mobile technologies, mobile phones, but also social media and Web 2.0, meaning things like Facebook, WeChat, Flickr, YouTube, Wikipedia, yeah, all of those things are actually not only accessible and familiar to most people, but they're also owned and controlled by the people who use them. I mean, I know that's not strictly accurate, because Facebook is owned by Facebook and Flickr is owned by Google and YouTube is owned by Google. But actually, for what most people do in Facebook and for what most people do in Flickr or Instagram or Twitter, they control it. So it's not what the government decides people need to learn, or what governments decide people need to do, or it's not the ministry or the publishers or the schools or the universities that decide what people do in Facebook, what they do in WeChat, what they do in Wikipedia, what they do in YouTube. These technologies are owned, you know, quote unquote, by the people that use them. And that might be people who are in the education system, because people in the education system, learners and teachers, are still using social media and are still using mobile phones. But actually, they're using them in ways that connect them with other communities and other constituencies and other groups in Facebook or in YouTube. And what I say here is that when people are using Facebook or Twitter or Wikipedia or YouTube or WordPress, what that's doing is sharing the experience of creating ideas, images, information, opinions, creating all of those things, all of those pieces of information or ideas or images, and then sharing them and discussing them and discarding them, transforming them, merging them, sharing them again. And that actually, that's exactly what education is. Education is the process of us creating ideas and information and sharing those ideas and information and having other people discuss them, criticize them, transform them, store them, reuse them. And so somehow what we're arguing is that professional educators need to find ways of getting in there and making all of those processes happen better. So when I'm saying people and communities, our cultures are using Facebook to share ideas, or people in YouTube are using video, that, you know, all of these things are things that individuals can create. I could make a podcast, put it in iTunes, and it might take me 15 minutes, or I could upload a video into YouTube or Facebook. Anyone could. So there's a lot of this happening, and I'd certainly argue it is education. I wouldn't necessarily argue it's good education, but we're arguing that educators ought to engage with what's happening in Facebook, Flickr, WeChat, YouTube, WordPress, because that's actually where people are spending their time. You know, if you ask how much time do people spend in school, how much time do people spend in Facebook, how many people are in Facebook, how many people are in school? Well, Facebook is the third largest country in the world. You know, and Apple has an economy the size of Poland. And at the moment, there is a very big discrepancy between people's digital and educational experiences within schools and colleges, you know, where maybe it's a network desktop computer inside a paywall where they are not in control, you know, where they're under the authority of the teacher, the university, the lecturer, and their experience of technology and learning outside that. I mean, and most people are outside college and school and university, and that's what they're doing, you know, and it isn't necessarily good, but there's a lot of it. You know, and even 20 years ago, this is dreadful, even 20 years ago, we have kids saying they go to school and they power down. So at home, they've got kind of 3 devices, 4 devices, they've got 7 different types of social media, they have freedom and agency, you know, they can do what they like, where they like. They go into school or college, they have to power down. They have a desktop computer and the university decides what they do. That was 20 years ago. And I think there's an increasing difference between what happens inside the education system and what happens outside the education system. And actually, most people are outside the education system. And we thought, as part of our recommendations, that actually there were a lot of innovative pedagogies that might be appropriate for any different discipline, but emerging in different communities, different research communities, different digital learning communities, and so on. And we provided some ideas about what they were and how they could be used. So they might, for example, there is the idea of curation or orchestration. You know, the idea that actually the world already has an enormous number of resources. You know, there are enormous numbers of podcasts, websites, downloads, videos, and we ought to be enabling learners to exploit those. You know, and so at my university, we still have lecturers that write their own course. And all around the world, another 5,000 lecturers are probably writing the same course. You know, do we need someone else writing introductory accountancy, you know, or an introduction to programming? And we're concerned with the education system, but also the ones outside the education system, the critical capacity to find stuff and to learn from it, not to learn from us, because we're only going to be there till they graduate. But they've got the rest of their lives where they need to be surviving in a world that is actually digital chaos. You know, so we need to help them make a transition so they can carry on learning from what is available, learning the good stuff from the bad stuff. So they can find stuff, but we don't want them learning that the earth is flat. But there are people out there on the internet that will tell you the earth is flat. And so there are 2 things going on. Actually, one is we need people, not just people inside universities, to be able to find stuff and actually to critically evaluate the good stuff and the bad stuff. But also, and to know how it is relevant to their context. You know, this is good, but is it relevant to me? You know, and maybe if you're only if you're never going to fly in an aeroplane, then maybe it doesn't really matter if the Earth is flat. Or maybe if you're never going to drive an aeroplane, it doesn't really matter if the Earth is flat. So is it relevant as well as is it good? Because the alternative is we just get lecturers inside university producing not such good stuff that MIT have already made available for free, or that the Open University in the UK have made available for free. But another pedagogy might be using learner-generated content, you know, because people value most what people like them have produced. So are there ways of actually maybe having project-based learning or web quests or whatever, where the students have some ownership of what they can learn from each other? So rather than us, I mean, sorry, let me see. I'm very, very old. My students are very, very young. There is a big gap between me and my students. They would have more connection with stuff that they produced for each other rather than geriatrics produced for them. But also, do they have the capacity to comment and correct and critique what each other are producing? You know, why should I be assessing what they're producing when they could each be assessing what each other is producing? So, and there were a whole lot of other ideas like this that we felt could be adapted into the social media, mobile learning, informal learning that people outside the education system would benefit from, so that they weren't distanced and disadvantaged from an education system that was already leaving them behind. And I don't know if there are any other kind of marginal extra points. I mean, there was also, if you like, a kind of alignment with our suggestion with the decolonization agenda. You know, because we hear a lot about decolonizing the curriculum, but then if the curriculum is still produced by global publishers working from American and European models, then in English, then getting people to find the material that suits them best in, or making learning material from the languages they use around the problems that they have, is part of the decolonization agenda. You know, and I get, sorry, I specifically relate to that maybe in the context of working in Palestine or the Middle East, you know, where there is not much material for learning available in Arabic, and there are not, and all of the pedagogies are coming from Western Europe, or from Western Europe, from the EU. And so clearly people in different cultures are going to learn better in their own languages, but actually in the kind of pedagogies that best suit them. So in terms of our recommendations, this was provided as a general template, but how it works in different cultures depends on those people in those cultures taking ownership of it. So what we were arguing that the global community needed to do was not produce more stuff, you know, not to put more resources online, not to create more school compliant content, but actually increase local capacity, train people to think about these ideas inside their communities, not to impose things from on top, but to work sideways, peer to peer, to say, you know, what do these various ideas mean in our community? And I suppose when we started this work a year ago, there was the notion that we were going to have COVID and then we were going to have post-COVID. And that was, and so therefore, what would happen was we would have 3 weeks of lockdown, we would have vaccinations, and then we'd go into something called post-COVID, which would be a new normal. And I don't think that's going to happen, because certainly in the UK, and I also did some work in Southern Africa, in Mozambique, Lesotho, Botswana, Zimbabwe, South Africa, and Namibia, looking at how the pandemic panned out in those countries. And what we see is it's not one wave that's kind of coherent and easy to conceptualize. It's a mess, it's chaotic. We see different variants of the pandemic breaking out. We see different sectors of the population becoming ill. So it might be more old people, or it might be specific pre-existing illnesses. We see different parts of the country, different parts of the continent, but we then see different governments using different strategies. So we see New Zealand being 6 months ahead of the game, and we see the UK being 6 months behind the game, and we probably see Brazil being 3 years behind the game in terms of their options, you know, track and trace, immunization, self-isolation. We see different governments adopting different strategies, but we see them adopting those different strategies early or late. And we then see governments coming under pressure to reconcile the economy versus mortality, you know, because we see lockdowns affecting public transport, shops, obviously education. We see schools, colleges, and universities shutting, and every time a lockdown is unlocked, we see an increase in mortality. So there's another lockdown. And but we also, certainly in the UK and in Europe, we see government policy, but we also see high profile breaches of government policy. You know, we see a government minister going for a drive, you know, breaking their own regulations. So we then see compliance becoming a problem, because people are then seeing, well, if that government minister can go shopping, then we can all go shopping. But as I say, there's also then a tension between keeping the economy going over, keeping the economy working, and keeping people alive. You can lock down everything, but then gross domestic product per capita goes down by 28%, and that's a big problem. So you then see increases in poverty, you see increases in mortality, domestic violence because of lockdown. So the cure becomes worse than the disease, and certainly you see massive injections of money to keep businesses afloat, or to keep people in furlough, as you know. The government is paying people to do nothing. And so governments have this problem that there is a big reduction in the tax base, because businesses and people are earning less, so you can't tax them so much. But you have an enormous increase in government spending to keep jobs and businesses viable. But in the education system, because of all of this, you then see not schools and colleges closing and then schools and colleges opening. What you see is some schools open for different age groups. some schools open for key workers, so if you're a doctor, your child can go to school. If you're a hairdresser, your child can't go to school. And you see some subjects, you can come into university to do biology laboratory, but you can't come in to do a philosophy seminar. And all of this is transient, volatile, unpredictable. And so that the idea that there is a post-COVID, that there is a new normal, that once we've done the first wave, the second wave, the third wave, and the fourth wave, it'll be over, is probably unrealistic, which is an argument for education systems that are much more flexible, or for learning that is much more flexible, that actually uses these kinds of strategies, because we need to be agile, flexible, responsive. We can't just switch on a university which has 30,000 students and then switch it off again. It's not going to work like that. No, it's just going to be COVID in the winter. 10,000 people die of influenza every year. It's normal. Get used to it. So maybe in the UK, 10,000 people every year will die of COVID. Get used to it. But maybe not. Maybe there is a lot of instability still to come. And we are arguing that this kind of strategy within local contexts is the way to have the necessary flexible, agile, rapid, cost-effective response to the ongoing, the continued pandemic. So that's, that's it. That's pretty much all I can say. And somewhere in the middle, I did say mobile. So that's okay, isn't it? And I'll stop there.
Professor, thank you so much. Actually, I am not expert in education, but I'm very much enlightened with your speech. Actually, I was very interested about your attitude about social media, because I have nephews and they spend so much time in social media and they are picking topics what they want to learn, just for instance, I'm just encouraging them to read Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, but they say that, okay, just it's old, we have YouTube, we have Instagram, and we learn lots of stuff from there. And we don't just want the traditional methods of, reading a book like what we did in the past.
Yeah, and
so
there's certainly,
very interesting.
I think the pandemic makes education very problematic, because we have to ask, what is education for? And one of the answers is always that we are putting people into the economy. We are putting people into employment. We are putting people into jobs. But if you then look at discussions about the fourth industrial revolution, it's not very clear what those jobs are. Mm-hmm. Certainly not in 10 years' time, 20 years' time, 30 years' time, 40 years' time. And the pandemic only makes that problem more extreme. Mm-hmm. If education is about putting people into jobs, and we really don't know what the pandemic will do to the jobs, I don't know. Well, I mean, an easy recent example is that in the UK, suddenly everyone wants to do nursing. Everyone wants to do a nursing degree.
What? Because they're going to find job easily, right? Because there's a demand in there.
Yeah. I mean, so there's obviously the different sectors of the economy are shifting around. Yeah. So even in the retail sector, you see a massive increase in home delivery.
Yeah, in Turkey as well.
And you see that shops in town centres are dying. No one is going into a shop. You know, so suddenly the retail sector needs drivers. But then, I mean, I guess that at the other extreme, there is a big rebalancing, you know, because if you look at how New Zealand has adapted, I guess they're economically 5 months ahead of everyone else.
Yeah.
You know, and whereas the American economy is going to be 5 months behind everyone else because they've got 500,000 dead people. You know, and they haven't started any kind of, I don't know, what do you call it, quantitative easing to keep the economy going or to keep people alive. But also, I suppose, if you think that, for example, the fourth industrial revolution already destabilizes the future, and you see what in the UK is called the hollowing out of the labour market, you know, the fact that the fourth industrial revolution means that in 30 years' time, you're either a brain sweeper or a toilet cleaner, and there's nothing in between.
Oh.
You know, so where does education fit in that? And the pandemic has then destabilized the economies already anyway. So, so it's then arguing for less training, more education. You know, there has been a political pressure in the UK for producing graduates that are job ready. It's a bit like oven ready. You know, it's a bit like kind of food that you can put straight in a microwave. Well, it's like graduates you can put straight into a corporation. But actually, we need graduates that are not job ready, that actually have the adaptability, the life skills, metacognition, rather than kind of having been told, if you want to be a data processor, if you want to be a database administrator, here's the things you need to know. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and we'll give you a qualification. Well, in 10 minutes' time, that may be completely different, or in 10 years, 10 months.
Yeah, I think the key word is being flexible, I guess. I think the most important thing is that in education, we need to be flexible. I guess I'm not an expert in education, but the you know, the consequence of the speeches to me is like this. You know, we need to be flexible in the education system, I guess.
And I think that's a real challenge. I mean,
yeah,
because you're asking universities, which may have 1,000 members of staff,
yeah,
to behave like organisations that have 5 members of staff. You know, in terms of flexibility, it's like trying to turn around an oil tanker.
Okay, just we have questions for you from our listeners. Just may I read it to you? Just,
yeah, sure.
If you let me. Can we use social media such as Facebook and Instagram as a mobile learning environment?
I think it's the other way around. That's where our learners are. It's our responsibility to reach out to them. I mean, mobile phones may be dreadful, Facebook may be dreadful, but where are our learners? That's where they are. So it's not a case of thinking that Facebook is imperfect. Yeah, sure, it is imperfect. But that's where people are. That's where they have familiarity, confidence. You know, and if you think about using Moodle or WebCT, how long does it take to train students to use it? And how much does it cost your university to pay for it? And to train lecturers to use it? You know, the license fees for WebCT are quite high.
Yeah. So let me look at another question for you. So I think that's all the questions. So we have a problem with the chat system right now. So sorry, they're writing me via WhatsApp. So
may I a question?
Yes. Yes.
I'm
Professor
sorry.
Yavuz has a question for you. Just
so
go for it, please.
similarly, I want to ask you a specific question about it. We know that there are some technological adaptation models for the organizations, such as technology acceptance model, technology environment and social model, to improve the dynamic capabilities of the organization. At this point, what do you think about distance learning? We need a new technological model to improve the distance learning systems. And I want to question any other specific question. We know that there's a huge differences between the developing countries and developed countries. For example, in developing countries, people spend more time for using the internet, social media, mobile communications. For example, Philippines people spend more than 8 hours on the internet. Japanese people spend 4 hours. What do you think about the difference between the developing and developed countries for the distance learning education system? Thank you.
Good. I have a big problem with developed versus developing. It sounds like our way of telling them they're not good enough yet.
But we're not good enough yet. So it is true, I guess. We're not good enough yet. So.
Well, no, but it's, yeah, but do you want to be eventually a copy of America, or do you want to be a better version of Turkey?
A better version of Turkey, I guess.
Yeah. And, you know, your culture in Turkey is clearly as developed or as established or has as much history as America, actually probably a lot more.
A lot more.
A lot more. But I mean,
yeah.
It is yours. You know, so this developing thing is like saying, well, would you like to wear someone else's clothes? You know, would you?
I change my question. I can change my question. What do you think about the difference between the countries, not developing or developed? There's a huge difference between the countries about the education. Okay.
I think, well, I think for any country, I mean, for example, Turkey, but also actually the UK, there are two things at work. One is actually there is a global knowledge economy. There is the World Wide Web. There is the information superhighway. We can't ignore the fact that, well, as I say, Apple is the size of Poland in terms of its economic power, and that global digital corporations control much of the resources of the world, and that, for example, in different ways, if Turkey wants to engage in the global economy, that's the way it is. But on the other hand, Turkey has its own language, traditions, culture, habits, ethics, religion, customs, heritage. And if you lose that, you stop being Turkish. You just become like America's 55th state. You know, or England actually will become, you know, England is in the same position. You might not think it, but actually we suffer from the problem of trying to copy or imitate American global corporations and losing our own culture. Maybe we're losing our own culture because we watch very, very bad American television, and we speak like Americans. But it seems to me the purpose of education is to recognize there are these two things going on. There is the local and the global, and we need the local and we need the global, and there is a balance, and each country and each community and each person has got to figure out where that balance is, and how it works best for them, and how they can keep one without losing the other. You know, how they can keep their identity, but also maintain access and visibility on the global economy political, and so on. And I think it's only when you've got that balance between the global and the local, you can start asking questions about what do individual educators do in terms of pedagogy, in terms of technology, because once you get down there, you can say, well, okay, global resources are clearly biased in favor of one way of learning, but my community has a different way of learning. Okay, so how do we optimize that? Or we could say that there is a global model for the university system. Universities all want to be on global league tables, and that imposes certain conditions and constraints. And that may impose certain conditions and constraints in terms of educational technology. Maybe we all need to have an LMS or a VLE because that's the way global universities do it, and that's the way global universities compete against each other. Although you could argue that's a zero-sum game, because the more one university wins, then the more another university loses. But also, our students or our communities or our learners have their own technologies, and we want to continue to empower them and value them, and help them do what they do most easily and most effectively. So this is a kind of very long answer that says I don't have an answer, but I think the answers are in the communities, not in the systems.
Okay. Zero-sum game. I liked your example. Thank you so much. So your speech was great, Professor. I cannot imagine how busy you are, and you shared your valuable time with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Okay.
Thank you so much.
And good luck with the rest of the conference. Thank you very much for asking me.
Thank you so much. Thank you. See you. Goodbye. Bye-bye.